I am delighted and honored and excited to introduce Ruha Benjamin. She's an associate professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. She's founder of the Just Data Lab and author of Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code, and editor of Captivating Technology, Reimagining Race, Carceral Technoscience, and Liberatory Imagination in Everyday Life, among many other publications. Ruha's work investigates the social dimensions of science, medicine, and technology with a focus on the relationship between innovation and inequity, health and justice, knowledge and power. She is a recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including from the American Council of Learned Societies, National Science Foundation, Institute for Advanced Study, and in 2017, she received the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton. Everyone, please enjoy and be inspired by this talk from Ruha Benjamin.
Thank you so much to the conference organizers for inviting me to be in conversation with all of you today. It's really my honor. As we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which I'm calling in from is the traditional and unceded territory of the Lenape people. Let's also acknowledge the intertwined legacies, that is the devastation of transatlantic slavery and settler colonialism, which contribute to the creation and continued wealth of this nation. We acknowledge the reparations owed to Black and Indigenous communities and nations and the impossibilities of return for generations past. We're alive today in an era of necessary resistance and awakening to preserve this planet and all the beautiful creation that is no doubt worthy of the struggle. Ashe. With that, let's begin a conversation about racing to the future. I'd like to suggest that one way of looking at our current moment is that the lights have been turned all the way on. And while some of us have had to develop night vision in order to navigate a world that was designed hostilely to get us, many people are for the first time beginning to witness the violent patterns and processes that plague everyday life. And so one of the things in terms of collective action to confront this reality is that we have to have some shared vision of what it is we're up against. What exactly are the contours of division and vision that shape our reality? I think too often we rely only on anecdata, that is our personal experiences and lenses to make sense of this reality, when we have to really begin to hone some shared conceptual lenses in order to then build collective action. And so what I want to suggest is that racism is one of many axes, one of many lenses that distort our collective vision. It distorts not only how we see, but how we're seen. It distorts not only how we know one another, but also how we come to know ourselves. And so while the kinds of distortions, that is deadly distortions, that tend to make the news are around racist police violence and profiling, as shown here, where Miami PD used these faces as target practice, thereby priming themselves to look for threat and danger in the faces of Black men. The distortions happen much more broadly and deeply. In this particular case, when this news circulated, clergy, mostly white clergy at the time, responded using the hashtag #UseMeInstead and put their own faces as a one way to call out the perversity of those who are sworn to protect and serve, associating danger with Blackness, this kind of everyday anti-Blackness that, again, I want to remind us is not relegated to simply one domain like policing, but pervades every institution. In this case, I have colleagues at the Yale School of Education who published findings from a study in which they put eye tracking technology on preschool teachers and then had them look at little children playing together and primed them, said, look for challenging behavior. And the teacher's attention continuously went to the little Black boys in the playgroup, even though they were behaving the same way as all the other children. And so this, on the other end of the spectrum, from police profiling to educational disciplinary profiling, is the kind of spectrum that we have to zoom the lens out and be able to see the patterns, the everyday anti-Blackness that infects all of our institutions. That we didn't wake up just seeing and being this way, but rather this form of racial architecture, racial vision has been shaped over time. One figure who was prominent in that creation is Georges Cuvier, French naturalist, who pitted whiteness against Blackness in this way: the white race with oval face, straight hair and nose, to which the civilized people of Europe belong, and which appear to us the most beautiful of all, is also superior to others by its genius, courage, and activity, which of course is juxtaposed to Blackness. The Negro race is marked by Black complexion, crisped of woolly hair, compressed cranium, and a flat nose, the projection of the lower parts of the face. And the monkey tribe, which it consists, have always remained in the most complete state of barbarism. So a lot going on here with Cuvier's description. One in which Blackness is always the polarity of whiteness, as part of the architecture of race. And that's why, despite the wide variety of humankind and many other racial ethnic groups, it's vital to understand this polarity, because it's the one upon which our racial architecture has been built. The other is to note how phenotype, that is bodies, are the map on which these other characteristics are placed, characteristics of behavior and culture and beauty and intelligence. And the reason is because in order to naturalize racial difference, scientists and their other sort of ambassadors of this racial vision needed to make it seem as if these differences were immutable, God-given, that it was not just simply them fabricating it in order to justify a political structure, but rather that this is something that we're born with, these differences, this hierarchy. And so part of the work that is upon us is to denaturalize this racial vision and division that continues to distort how we see one another and how we're seen. It continues to infect our visual culture today. And this is one example of many, many that I could choose from, in which we see this Vogue cover with LeBron and Giselle mirroring this World War I propaganda poster, in which the Germans are brutish in that case, but how both the positioning of LeBron, his hand posture, the shoe sneaker choice, always in comparison to the frailty, the beauty of whiteness. So to understand this binary and understand this brutishness that recalls Cuvier's description, that is something that still haunts our visual culture and our sense of who we each are. Which brings us to technology, where if you type, for example, a simple exercise in your Google images, unprofessional hairstyles or professional hairstyles, you'll see a pattern emerge in which unprofessional will bring up mostly Black women wearing their hair naturally, and professional will bring up mostly white women with their hair in, very traditional styles, stereotypically, posh styles, except some exceptions. We have the Hunger Games lady over there on your left, and you have Beyonce on your right, but exceptions notwithstanding, there's a general pattern that we observe that again recalls Cuvier's description of uncivilized associated with Negroes. And so unprofessional continues to be coded with Blackness or associated with Blackness. And discrimination with respect to hair is so pervasive that some US states have actually had to pass laws. In California, it's called the Crown Act, that prohibits discrimination against Black women's various hairstyles. And so this is just one sort of simple exercise that gets us to confront how we continue to make these judgments that use the body as a proxy for deeper qualities and capacities. And so while this may seem like a simple sort of aesthetic exercise, the stakes are raised when we get to other arenas like healthcare and policing. Before we jump into that, though, I want to suggest that part of our shared vision has to move beyond a techno-deterministic rendering of social reality, where technology is painted as either totally bad or good. On your left is the techno-dystopian variety in which the robots are going to get us. They're going to slay us. They're going to take all the jobs. They're going to remove human agency. And that's the story that Hollywood likes to sell us. On your right is the techno-utopian story that the robots are going to save us. They're going to heal us. They're more efficient. They're more equitable. And of course, this is the Kool-Aid that Silicon Valley likes to sell us. And although on the surface these seem like opposing stories, they share an underlying logic. That is, technology is in the driver's seat. And it removes the human agents behind the screen who are producing this reality, this digital reality. And as it stands, it's a very narrow slice of humanity whose worldviews, whose imagination, desires, biases, assumptions are being encoded into our digital infrastructures. And so part of reclaiming and regaining power is to refute both ends of that story, the techno-dystopian or utopian, and really point to the human agency that's shaping this, and in order to broaden participation and democratize this process. So to that end, I want to offer three main takeaways that kind of are the strands that will shape the rest of my comments, and we can use any of these as a jumping off point for discussion. The first takeaway is that I want us to understand racism as productive, not in the sense of being good, but in the literal capacity of racism to produce things of value to some, even as it wreaks havoc on others. Because many of us are still taught to think and talk about racism as if it were an aberration, a glitch, an accident, an isolated incident, a bad apple in the backwoods and outdated, rather than as innovative, systemic, diffuse, and attached incident, the entire orchard, in the ivory tower, in the tech industry, forward-looking, productive. In my field of sociology, we often say race is socially constructed, but we often fail to state the corollary that racism constructs. Secondly, I'd like us to think about the way that race and technology shape one another, because more and more people are accustomed to thinking about the ethical and social impacts of technology, which is important, but that's only half of the story, because social norms, values, structures all exist prior to any given tech development. So it's not simply about the impact, but also the social inputs that make some inventions appear inevitable and desirable, which leads to a third provocation. That is, imagination is a contested field of action, not an ephemeral afterthought that we have the luxury to dismiss or romanticize, but a battleground, a resource, an input and output of technology and social order. In fact, we should acknowledge that most people are forced to live inside someone else's imagination. And one of the things we have to come to grips with is how the nightmares that many people are forced to endure are the underside of elite fantasies about efficiency, profit, and social control. So racism, among other axes of domination, helps to produce this fragmented imagination where you have misery for some, monopoly for others. That means for those of us who want to construct a different social reality, one that's grounded in justice and joy, we can't only critique the underside, but we also have to wrestle with the deep investments, the desire even that many people have for social domination. So that's the sort of trailer, the main takeaways. Now let's turn to some more specifics, beginning with a relatively new app called Citizen, which will send you real-time crime alerts based on a curated selection of 911 calls. It also offers a way for users to report, live stream, and comment on purported crimes via the app. And it'll show you incidents as red dots on a map so you can avoid particular areas, which is just a slightly less racialized version of other apps called Ghetto Tracker, and Sketch Factor, which use public data to help people avoid supposedly dangerous areas. Now, some of you are probably thinking, what could possibly go wrong in the age of barbecue Becky's calling the police on Black people cooking, walking, breathing, bird watching out of place? It turns out that even a Stanford-educated environmental scientist living in the Bay Area, pictured here, is an ambassador of the carceral state calling the police on a cookout at Lake Merritt. It's worth noting too that this app, Citizen, was originally called the less chill name Vigilante. And in its rebranding, it also moved away from encouraging people to stop crime, but rather now simply to avoid it. As one member of the New York City Council put it, crime is now at historic lows in the city, but because residents are constantly being bombarded with push notifications of crime, they believe the city is going to hell in a handbasket. Not only is this categorically false, it's distracting people from very real public safety issues like reckless driving or rising opioid use that don't show up on the app. What's most important to our discussion, I think, is that Citizen and other tech fixes for social problems aren't simply about technology's impact, but they're also about how social norms and values, racial norms and values, shape what tools are imagined necessary in the first place. So this dynamic is what I take up in two new books. The first examining the interplay between race, automation, and machine bias more broadly as an extension of older forms of racial domination. The second is an edited volume on the carceral dimensions of technology across a wide range of social arenas, from more traditional sites like policing and prisons to less obvious contexts like the retail industry, financial technologies, and the digital service economy. Both books are wrestling in different ways with the way that technology captivates, in the sense of fascinating, charming, and bewitching, while also potentially subduing and subjugating people. To wrestle with this duplicity, first we have to pierce through the fancy rhetoric and buzzwords of tech utopianism. To that end, I'd like to pause for just a moment for a brief speculative interlude, a clip from a film by one of my favorite filmmakers, Alex Rivera, from Sleep Dealers.
So here's a clip, it's about 3 minutes long. In this scene, you'll see the character as he crosses the border for the first time. So you'll see he's in Mexico, but he comes to America in a new way.
Cerca de la colonia donde vivía, en las afueras de la ciudad, estaban las infomaquilas, los sleep dealers.
Este es el sueño americano. Le damos a los Estados Unidos lo que siempre han querido. Todo el trabajo, sin los trabajadores. José está en un matadero en Iowa. Y María es niñera de una niñita en Washington. Ustedes tres van a estar en una chambota en San Diego. Muchacho, enchúfate. Tu futuro empieza hoy.
Español.
All right, so, you know, there's, again, so much going on, just even in that clip, much less the longer film, but there's just two things that I just want to point out for our purposes today. The first is that the clip reminds us that automation does not get rid of embodiment, that in fact, for some, it often means the intensification and violent sort of intrusion of certain kinds of embodiment and surveillance. The other is that the film illustrates how the fantasy of some is the nightmare of others. For those on the other side of these sleep dealing warehouses who are experiencing the conveniences of this automation, that is a fantasy that relies on the nightmare that's being lived in this particular world, in this clip. So how should we understand this duplicity of tech fixes, purported solutions that nevertheless reinforce and even deepen existing hierarchies? In terms of popular discourse, what got me interested in that question was the proliferation of headlines and hot takes about so-called racist and sexist robots. There was a first wave of stories a few years ago that seemed to be shocked at the prospect that, in Langdon Winner's terms, artifacts have politics. A second wave seemed less surprised. Well, of course, technology inherits its creators' biases. And now I think we've entered a phase of attempts to override and address the default settings of racist and sexist robots, for better or worse. And one of the challenges we face is how to meaningfully differentiate technologies that are used to differentiate us. Take, for example, a recent study. Racial bias in a medical algorithm favors white patients over sicker Black patients, reports Obermeyer and colleagues, in which the researchers were actually able to look inside the black box of algorithm design, which is typically not possible with proprietary systems. What's especially important to note here is that the algorithm does not explicitly take note of race. That is to say, it's race neutral. By using cost to predict healthcare needs, this digital triaging system unwittingly reproduces racial disparities in healthcare because on average, Black people incur fewer costs for a variety of reasons, including systemic racism. And in my review of the study by Obermeyer and colleagues, I argue that indifference to social reality on the part of tech designers and adopters can be even more harmful than malicious intent. In the case of this widely used healthcare algorithm affecting millions of people, more than double the number of Black patients would have been enrolled in programs designed to help them stay out of the hospital if the predictions were actually based on need rather than cost. So race neutrality, it turns out, can be a deadly force. This combination of coded bias and imagined objectivity is what I've termed the new Jim Code, innovation that enables social containment while appearing fairer than discriminatory practices of a previous era, which of course in the United States is called Jim Crow. What I'm drawing attention to with this concept is that technology can hide the ongoing nature of social domination and allow it to penetrate every facet of our lives under the guise of progress. In my work, I encourage us to think about how anti-Blackness gets encoded in and exercised through automated systems by offering 4 conceptual offspring to the new Jim Code that fall along a kind of spectrum from the most obvious engineered inequity to the most insidious techno-benevolence. For the sake of time, I'm just going to sketch out the last 2 and encourage you to engage with race after technology because these are the structuring concepts for the different chapters. So they go into much more depth. So coded exposure names the tension between ongoing surveillance of racialized populations and calls for digital recognition and inclusion, the desire to literally be seen by technologies. What I'd like to underscore though is that it's not only in the process of being out of sight, but also in the danger of being too centered that racialized groups are made vulnerable, so that being included is not simply positive recognition, but can be a form of unwanted exposure and attention, but not without creative resistance, as I'll come back to in just a moment. But first, one more short clip that illustrates one side of this dialectic.
Hello? Motion sensors. Motioning. Motioning. Please sense me.
Oh, one other thing. Lem mentioned that there's something weird going on with the motion sensors in the lab.
Oh, yeah. We replaced all the sensors in the building with a new state-of-the-art system that's going to save money. It works by detecting light reflected off the skin.
Well, Lem says it doesn't work at all.
Lem's wrong. It does work. Although there is a problem. It doesn't seem to see black people.
The system doesn't see black people?
I know. Weird, huh?
That's more than weird, Veronica. That's basically, well, racist.
The company's position is that it's actually the opposite of racist because it's not targeting black people, it's just ignoring them. They insist the worst people can call it is indifferent.
Nothing. We never should have let that white guy off.
We're 8 black men in an elevator. Of course the white guy's gonna get off. Veronica? Oh, God, this looks way too aggressive.
No, it's okay. I think I know why you're all here. Well, most of you.
I have something prepared. Veronica, you are a terrific boss.
Thank you, Lem. I'll take it from here. Let me start by apologizing on behalf of Viridian for this inexcusable situation.
I laid into Veronica pretty good. I figured it was my only shot, so I took the gloves off.
Wow, that sounds great, Lem. Sounds like you gave the company a really strong message.
Oh, yeah. She said they're working 24/7 to make things right. Can you believe this?
I know, isn't it great? We all get our own free white guys.
You like it?
Yeah. Hey, Todd's the best. He anticipates everything I need. Plus, he picked up my dry cleaning. Oh, and he got this kink out of my neck.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
My white guy sucks.
Well, maybe you're just not using yours right.
Yeah, maybe it's on you, dude.
Shut up, Stu.
I got the worst black guy.
It turned out Lem had also been thinking about the money issue. And he put together some interesting numbers to show us. And then, we all went to speak to management in a language they could understand. Within a margin of error of plus or minus 1%. And so, if the company keeps hiring white people to follow black people, to follow white people, to follow black people by
Thursday, June 27th, 2013.
every person on Earth will be working for us. And we don't have the parking for that.
No way.
All right. Sometimes you have to laugh to keep from crying. And so the show for me brilliantly depicts how a superficial corporate diversity ethos, the prioritization of efficiency over equity, and the default whiteness of tech development work together to ensure that innovation literally produces containment in this case. So the fact that darker skinned employees are unable to use the elevators, doors, water fountains, or turn the lights on is treated as a minor inconvenience in service to a greater good. But good for whom is what we have to continuously ask. Finally, some of the most interesting developments, I think, are those we can think of as techno-benevolence that aims to address bias in various ways. Take, for example, how new to AI techniques to vet job applicants. A company called HireView aims to, quote, reduce unconscious bias and promote diversity in the workplace by using an AI-powered program that analyzes recorded interviews of prospective employees. So it uses thousands of data points, including verbal and nonverbal cues like facial expression, posture, vocal tone, and then compares job seeker scores with those of existing top performing employees to decide who to flag as a desirable hire and who to reject. So the sheer size of many applicant pools and the amount of time and money that companies pour into recruitment is astronomical. So companies like HireVue can narrow the eligible pool at a fraction of the time and cost. And so hundreds of companies worldwide have signed on, everyone from Goldman Sachs, Hilton, Unilever, Red Sox, the Atlantic Public Schools, Vodafone, and the list goes on. Another value added, according to HireVue, is that there's a lot that a human interviewer misses that AI can keep track of to make, quote, data-driven talent decisions. After all, the problem of employment discrimination is widespread and well documented. So the logic goes, wouldn't this be even more reason to outsource decisions to AI? Well, consider a study by a Princeton team of computer scientists, which examined whether a popular algorithm trained on human writing online exhibited the same racially biased tendencies that psychologists have documented among humans. In particular, they found that the algorithm associated white-sounding names with pleasant words and black-sounding names with unpleasant ones, which actually builds on a classic audit study from about 2002 or 3, in which two University of Chicago economists sent out thousands of resumes to employers in Boston and Chicago and found the same pattern of discrimination based on names alone when they did this audit. So too with gender-coded words and names, as Amazon learned a few years ago when its own hiring algorithm was found discriminating against women. Nevertheless, it should be clear why technical fixes that claim to bypass human biases are so desirable. If only there was a way to slay centuries of racist and sexist demons with a social justice bot. Beyond desirable, more like magical. Magical for employers, perhaps, looking to streamline the grueling work of recruitment, but a curse for many job seekers. As this headline puts it, your next interview could be with a racist bot, bringing us back to that problem space we started with. Though it's worth noting that some job seekers are already developing ways to subvert the system by trading answers to employers' tests and creating fake applications as informal audits of their own. In fact, one HR employee for a major company recommends slipping the words Oxford or Cambridge into our CVs with invisible white text to pass the automated screening. In terms of a more collective response, Federation of European Trade Unions called UNI Global has developed a charter of digital rights for workers touching on automated and AI-based decisions to be included in bargaining agreements. Another development that keeps me somewhat hopeful is that tech workers themselves have increasingly been speaking out against the most egregious forms of corporate collusion with state-sanctioned racism. For example, thousands of Google employees condemned the company's collaboration on a Pentagon program that uses AI to make drone strikes more effective. And a growing number of Microsoft employees are opposed to the company's ICE contract, saying that, quote, as the people who build the technologies that Microsoft profits from, we refuse to be complicit. And as this article published by Science for the People reminds us, contrary to popular narratives, organizing among technical workers has a vibrant history, including engineers and technicians in the 60s and 70s who fought professionalism, reformism, and individualism to contribute to radical labor organizing. The current tech workers movement, which includes students across our many institutions, can draw from past organizers' strategies and challenges in learning to navigate the contradictions and complexities of organizing in tech today. In terms of education, which I think of as one of the ground zeros for planting a deeper approach to deep learning, as it were, I'll also mention one concrete resource that you all can download for free called the Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech Handbook, which was developed by some wonderful colleagues at the Data and Society Research Institute. The aim of this intervention is threefold: to develop an intellectual understanding of how structural racism operates in social media platforms, algorithms, and technologies not yet developed; an emotional intelligence concerning how to resolve racially stressful situations within organizations; and a commitment to take action to reduce harms to communities of color. In that spirit, the best news I can share with you is that there are many different tech justice organizations that are growing and proliferating all over the world, including data for Black Lives and the Detroit Community Tech Project that's mostly based here in the US, but also a lot of things happening in other countries, which I'm happy to share, including colleagues and comrades in Brazil who've been at the forefront of building liberatory approaches to tech that center Black communities, including Preta Lab, led by Silvania Bahia, which focuses on Black women programmers and activists, Perifa Code, an organization that works with young people living in the favelas, Quebradev, which organizes workshops and a podcast with the aim of democratizing technology and centering the experiences of Afro-Brazilians and people who live in favelas, and Blogueiras Negras, Black women bloggers, which was one of the first hubs of Black digital activism in Brazil. And there's so many more initiatives I could mention. We have to remind ourselves as we build this momentum and build this movement, this is part of a much longer data justice struggle that we can turn to W.E.B. Du Bois's work and his data visualizations, to Ida B. Wells Barnett's expert deployment of statistics in the Red Record. This is a tradition that we today are compelled to carry on. To close then, let me end with the late legal and critical race scholar, Derek A. Bell, who encouraged a radical assessment of reality through creative methods and racial reversals, insisting that to see things as they really are, you must imagine them for what they might be, which is why I'm convinced that the arts and humanities are vital to any conversation and any movement working for data justice. One of my favorite examples of what we might call a Bellian racial reversal is this parody project that begins by subverting the anti-Black logics embedded in new high-tech approaches to crime prevention. Instead of using predictive policing techniques to forecast street crime, the white-collar early warning system flips the script by creating a heat map that flags city blocks where financial crimes are likely to occur. The system not only brings the hidden but no less deadly crimes of capitalism into view, but includes an app that alerts users when they've entered high-risk areas to encourage citizen policing and awareness. Taking it one step further, the development team is working on a facial recognition program to flag individuals who are likely perpetrators. And the training set used to design the algorithm includes the profile photos of 7,000 corporate executives downloaded from LinkedIn. Not surprisingly, the averaged face of a criminal is white and male. To be sure, creative exercises like this are only comical when we ignore that all of its features are drawn directly from actually existing proposals and practices in the real world, including the use of facial images to predict criminality. By deliberately and inventively upsetting the status quo in this manner, analysts and artists can better understand and expose the many forms of discrimination embedded in and enabled by technology. So here's my final proposition. If it is the case that inequity and injustice is woven into the very fabric of our society, from our educational system to our criminal punishment system to our computer systems, then it means each twist, coil, and code is a chance for us to weave new patterns, practices, and politics. The vastness of the problems that we're up against will be their undoing once we accept that we are pattern makers. So if, as I suggested at the start, an ahistoric and asocial approach to machine learning and AI captures and contains, then a historically and sociologically grounded approach opens up possibilities and pathways. It creates new settings, encodes new values, and builds on critical intellectual traditions that have continuously developed insights and strategies grounded in justice. And my hope is that we will all find ways to build on this tradition.
Okay, we're back. Here with Ruha. Thank you so much for that.
My pleasure. Thank you for listening. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And I think it's a lot of material that our audience in particular needs to hear. One of the things I kind of wanted to start with, because we talk about it a lot in terms of what we're trying to do, is just restoring agency in the midst of all of these things that seem like they could be insurmountable in certain, you know, because they're just such deeply ingrained inequities in our society. And so there were a couple of things you said, you know, one, in terms of media arts, which is what kind of the space that we're in, this space between how race and technology are co-produced and how imagination as a contested field of action is directly kind of the intersection that we're talking about. And so at the end of Race After Technology, you talked a little bit about white collar crime risk zones. And also bail block, I believe, which we showed here in 2018. And so I was just wondering if you had those in any more, as artists, I think it's really easy to feel like in the midst of all this, that sort of work is a luxury or not important. And if you have any thoughts on like why it has particular use and agency in this time to, you know, help move the needle on this stuff, I'd be appreciative.
Yeah, absolutely. It really circles back to the first part of your reflection, which is anything that we can do to call into question the inevitability of the particular technologies that we happen to have now. And so, and that's where imagination comes in, is to show that what we have now wasn't inevitable. It was created through choices that people, organizations, companies have made. And so a particular experience that I had recently that hit that home for me was a student run conference here at Princeton that was all about innovation. And one of the other speakers was one of the main personalities behind the Singularity University and that whole phenomenon. And he was speaking right before me through a kind of, you know, Zoom virtual thing like what I'm doing now. And the last thing he kind of said to the students, this hall packed with students, was basically, this is what's happening, X, Y, and Z, what I've laid out for you. This is what's coming. You either get on board or you get out of the way. And so it was a very deterministic, very like there was no agency. It was, but what was considered, what's couched as agency there is your ability to choose to be part of this thing that we have created or not. But there's no third way to say, no, we don't want this, but we want to channel our agency in another direction. And so the first thing I did as soon as I got up there was like, he's wrong. you do have a choice. You don't have to either get out of the way or get on the train that they've set for us. And so really thinking about art as a vehicle to concretize, to imagine that third, fourth, fifth option, rather than just having these choices that are set for us. And so in addition to the white collar early warning system, there are also so many other actual initiatives that are reframing the problem in the way that white collar is. For example, based in the Bay Area, the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which, you know, is taking the lens and rather than pathologizing people who are trying to struggle to make rents and like stay in their homes, it's turning the data and the digital sort of lens back on those who are producing risk in terms of the housing market, the realtors, the landlords, collecting data, visualizing data, and equipping housing justice advocates with that information. In some ways, it's a actual, you know, tool, whereas the white collar early warning system is still in the speculative phase. I do know of a project that was a collaboration between some people in policy, law, STS, in which it was in the context of the criminal legal system. And they also added a speculative component to their work where rather than calculating the riskiness of defendants on trial or people up for parole, they turned the lens back onto judges and calculated how likely judges would be to, you know, go against the Constitution and make judgments that were, you know, harmful in a whole variety of cases. And so for those interested in that last example, you can look up a quick write-up about that work under the title Studying Up on Medium. by a group of colleagues who put that together. And so there's a number of ways that, and so part of the thing I just want to impress upon us is that the media arts is not only about like the literal kind of way in which we think about imagination in terms of VR or literal storytelling. It's about all of the ways that we tell stories through data, like a bland statistics, like a chart, you know, is a kind of storytelling in the way that it tries to remove the subjectivity and purport neutrality. And so in some ways we want to pull out the narratives that are embedded in everything, not just in literal storytelling, and think about the creativity in that way, that more expansive way as well.
Yeah, great. Kalani, do you have any?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the thread in your talk about the duplicity of tech solutions, and also this idea of like the fantasy of one relying on the nightmare of another, right? And so I'm someone who works with artists, but also I work in industry. I'm a technologist and I'm working with startups and I'm part of that Silicon Valley ecosystem. And, you know, really glad to have your book in my hands. And, you know, I know that it's been referred to as sort of a field guide. And so I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about the ways people in industry can apply some of these things.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And in fact, it's been, I think, the most surprising thing about the reception to race after technology is the fact that people in industry have found it useful, because that was not my intended audience. So whereas there are many great books that I could recommend that are directed much more towards practitioners and people in the tech industry, I wanted this to be a field guide for people in community organizations, students thinking about which direction they want to take, the sort of intellectual foundations to resist the new Jim Code, more so than for those who are in the industry. Now, but what I said is like, I've been happy to see so much receptivity by those who are working in the context that I'm critiquing, to think anew about their own responsibility. And I tend to think about mobilizing and power in that context collectively. So as in the talk where I sort of mentioned tech won't build it, and other organizing efforts where tech workers collectively, even if individually you feel like you don't have much say or power to redirect, you know, various contracts or things that your employer's doing, collectively there's much more power, I think. And so that's where I really encourage people to think about what kind of organizing practices, whether in the form of unions or other collaborations, inside outside collaborations with community-based organizations. There is a book recently that I read that's much more pointed towards individual practitioners and what they can do. Two books actually. Design Justice by Sasha Costanza-Chock. Three books actually. So the second one is Data Feminism by Lauren Klein and Catherine D'Ignazio. Data Feminism and Design Justice offer really, really great, pragmatic, principled suggestions, advice, manifestos for what people in industry can do. And last but not least, the most irreverent, but I think also useful book is Ruined by Design by Michael Montoyo. And so for those who are kind of looking like, okay, I get the problem, what individually can I do? These three books I think are a great starting place to put in conversation with my own work that isn't primarily directed towards people in industry.
Thank you for that.
I don't know if we have any, I see Tiffany in here. If we have any questions from the, if you're in the lounges and have questions, please chat them in and we'll bring them up.
I actually see one here from Huntress, actually.
Oh, great.
Awesome. Yeah, I can go ahead and read that. And this was something that they were chatting about during the talk also. So it says, Ruha, how do you think we can build better relationships between medicine and the oppressed? Doctors, Black trans people and women that they are in conflict with. I wish there was a way to re-educate and create a discussion, not arguments and dismissal and violence.
Yes, yes to all of that. And again, there's some really great initiatives, movement building happening. I would really encourage anyone who's interested in that important question to check out the Health Justice Commons, which offers popular education tools, facilitation guides, It has a medical abuse hotline so that when harm is done, you have somewhere to call and report, and gathering data again on those everyday kinds of medical harms that cut across different social groups. So check out the Health Justice Commons. It's relatively new. Many of the initial founders are based in the Bay Area. I'm affiliated with it. And so check out all of the great resources that they have to do almost exactly what you described, Huntress. And so plugging into their work, and also like thinking about, if you're not in the Bay Area, sort of taking those tools and applying them in other locales is also really great. Another organization for those who are health practitioners, in the same way that Kalani, you asked what tech practitioners can do, people who are working in the healthcare industry, an organization I would really encourage you to plug into is White Coats for Black Lives, that have been responsible for organizing a lot of the direct action and die-ins and protests during COVID, but also well before COVID, following Michael Brown's murder. And they have chapters all over the country. And for me, they offer a wonderful model of what professional organizing can look like. And I hope that something similar is bubbling that might unify people working, whether it's in engineering schools or whether it's working in other kind of STEM fields, where you think about, even if you're one of the few people at your institution or your company or organization, when you begin to step back and think, but I share these concerns and these issues with like-minded people across different places, that we can organize together and have a much greater effect than if I just think about, joining forces with people just in my own context. And so check out White Coats for Black Lives and the Health Justice Commons as two different ways to get at that question.
Thank you.
Is there anything else from the?
Curious what Ruha is working on now and looking forward to coming up here.
Yeah, that's the good question. It's like the book is still like, still warm, but people want to know, well, what's next?
Yeah.
I love it. We can't rest. I'm working on a book tentatively titled Viral Justice, that's looking at this context of pandemic and policing, and really thinking about what we can learn in terms of everyday forms of action that people can do, not just organizing as the kind of things I just described, but really thinking about individual agency again in this context. So I'm working on a book. It's part memoir, part manifesto, called Viral Justice. I'm working on a children's book that's kind of like Goldilocks meets the Nextdoor app, with some surveillance and some fake news in the mix. And so if there's any illustrators out there, I'm working on that children's book, so ping me. And so those are the two main things I'm doing right now.
Have you ever worked within or in collaboration in any sort, this festival has had a lot of artists working within sort of VR simulations and narratives and things like that. And clearly with the movie clip, you are into movie-based story and narrative. Have you ever worked in any of those sorts of forms? Or are you interested in it, or those projects?
I haven't directly, but two really close colleagues have brought me into the process that they've been working on. Kamal Sinclair, who was at Sundance making a new reality, and the Guild of Future Architects. So that is one way that I'm plugged in, and also Desmond Patton at Columbia University. Do you hear that little ring? Okay.
I think that might be, Kalani had a fire alarm test that may have happened during.
Well, tell us if you smell smoke, Kalani. It's not worth
Feel free to run if you.
Yeah. So to answer your question, not directly, but through Professor Desmond Patton's work at Columbia and Kamal Sinclair's work, I've been sort of engaging it from afar. I haven't done anything directly in that space yet.
Well, if you're interested, I'm sure there are a bunch of people listening that would love to collaborate. Here's just a couple more questions here. Tiffany says, how many of these issues are unique to tech versus just the latest tendrils of capitalism enabled or scaled by tech? Can we make meaningful change while working within neoliberal capitalist frameworks?
The short answer to the second question is no, we can't. We have to think about the entire ecosystem. And that a huge part of the ecosystem has to do with the political economy. Just yesterday, I believe, there was announced the real Facebook Oversight Committee. For those who are interested, I'll tweet it out after we get off. But again, thinking about how in response to so much of the research and public criticism around these issues, one of the responses has been to what I think of as domesticate the critique by creating in-house ethics boards, in-house regulatory frameworks, when what we really need is to think about, much more independent forms of, and it's regulation is the wrong word, protections is the right word. And part of that has to think about, we have to think about how the economic incentives to continue to create one or the other tech-mediated form of discrimination are just so overpowering that all of these little attempts to tweak the edges by making things fair or more representative are really gonna not gonna take us very far. And so I think experiments like platform cooperativism, which if you haven't taken a look at platformcoop.com, I think it is, or org, that and other kind of explicit attempts to think about the economic model in conjunction with these issues of democracy and discrimination and so on are really, really key.
All right, and maybe one more here, which is feeds directly into sort of the content that we saw earlier this week, which is interested in the points about posthumanism, digital identities, and race after technology, especially in light of Laturbo Avedon's talk yesterday. What do we make of the ability to adopt an entirely different physical identity that does not necessarily map onto our own physical identity, a different physical identity, but still carries the social codes of the real world?
Yeah, that's interesting. My thoughts around that question and around the larger conversation around, posthumanism is really for us to think about what elements of our everyday kind of mundane social reality continue to create parallel universes where we can't even be our full selves in the physical world and where our flesh and blood is distorted through racist lenses and sexist lenses. So in some ways, my own concerns have less to do with parsing the politics and ethics of how this takes shape in VR or in the digital sphere, but to have us really examine how our everyday social interactions are really, again, distorted is the best word that I can find, or filtered, or augmented by social technologies like racism or sexism or classism, where, walking down the street, I can look like a scary, mean, whatever. So, like if you look at the language used to justify police killings, it's a human being there, but because of the augmentations and distortions of racism and sexism and so on, people are not seeing their fellow human beings in the light of day. And so I would just redirect our conversation and questions to thinking on the ground about how we can transform that reality so that we truly see one another, rather than wrestle with the ethics and politics. And I won't say rather, there are people who are doing that and that work is really valuable, but that's just not my main concern.
Well, thank you so much, Ruha. We really appreciate you being here, and I could not think of a better talk to sort of wrap up the things that we've been thinking about all throughout this festival.
Thank you so
Really
much for
appreciate your
having
time.
me. Thank you for inviting me into this wonderful conversation and community, and I hope to join you in person one day soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Anytime you want, you're invited.
Thank you.